Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lasoch b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Okay, I want to welcome everybody here. I mean, after this this last week down here in Texas, it was the week that was, and I hope everybody didn't have too bad a time with the broken pipes and so forth. I know Ed and so forth. They had Ed and Colette. They had an adventure. I don't know about Lynn and Goodwin, how you guys, or Mickey, you were here. I guess you guys are all right.
Well, I may embarrass Lynn a little bit and Gudrun, but I need to compliment them. I need to give them praise. I need oxygen.
Yes.
Require oxygen. I have oxygen concentrators that require power. Lynn spent most every night at my house this week, keeping a generator that he brought over up and running to keep me in oxygen. And we also had a pipe leak. He fixed that too.
Well, how about that? That's a good friend there.
That's a man sent from God. That's an angel sent from God to me. And Lynn, and of course, Gudrun had to suffer a little bit over there because Lynn was over here, but I would not have made it through this week.
Yeah, you call me anytime, buddy.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, that's good, and that's
bless
what
you, Lynn.
I had asked, or I'd read a few things just to get into this. Somebody had texted or put on a post or something like that, wondering, well, why in Texas did they there weren't any stories or anything like that of people rioting. There was no riots anywhere in Texas, and there were no looting, breaking into stores and breaking windows and so, there's really two reasons for that. Number one reason is we're Texans and we don't do that stuff. And then the number two reason is we're Texans and it was cold. So we don't do that in the cold. So anyway, but I heard many stories of people helping each other out, and just right in our own little town, people said, well, I heard so-and-so didn't have any power or anything, and they're old folks, so we would just cook up our dinner and cook up a little extra, stick it in a cooler to keep it warm, insulated box there to keep it warm, and then we'd drive down there every day or a couple of times a day to make sure they had warm food. And so I said, yeah, that's the way we do it down here. So anyhow, all right, well, let's go ahead and get cranking here tonight, because we do have a lot to do. I wanted to keep I'm just going to slide through these slides because you've seen them so many times. Wanted to tonight to do our moment in time, talking about monetary systems, and I thought, well, that would be kind of interesting to look at. In that, okay, what did they do in the Iron Age period? And that's the period that we're actually talking about here now. We will be actually looking at the Iron Age period all the way through this course of study up into the Greek period, and what did they do? Well, and the period that we're talking about right now, that it's around 900 BCE. Well, that is still in the barter system. Bartering, if you wanted something, you would trade something of an agreed value that someone else had. And the pictures that I saw, a guy's got some apples. Well, another guy's got some I don't know what you'd call it, grape nuts or something, but it's it's something, and so you'd agree on that, and you'd trade it. Now, it's kind of funny because we still do a little bit of that kind of stuff today. will say, with somebody says, I need this and that and the other, and they said, well, tell you what, if you'll come over and help me with doing this, then I'll do that for you. And I don't know if any of y'all have ever done that, but that is a type of bartering also. You'd trade a service for either another service or for a commodity of some sort. And so that has been the way it was all the way, forever, and it still goes on a little bit today. And it's something that we still you still will see from time to time, depending on where you are in the country, in the world, and even in the United States. Sometimes you'll see that where people will trade this out for that, and that's just the way we would do that, and that's what they did back in that time. Now, along about coins actually were invented. They came about around 600, I guess, about 600 BCE, and that's a couple of hundred years after, about 300 years after where we are today. But I thought, well, we'll talk about the barter system, is what they would do during this time frame, and then even soldiers and stuff like that in the time that we're talking about, how would they get paid? Well, in some cases, they would get paid with food commodities of some sort, and a little bit later on with the Romans, they were paid in salt. Actually, they actually got part of their pay was bags of salt, and so that from that we get that saying that this guy's not really worth his salt, or he is worth his salt, and that's where that comes from. It is that the pay that they gave to soldiers in the Roman era were they would give them salt, and then the soldiers themselves then could trade that salt for whatever, some other commodities or a service or something that they would want, because salt was a valuable commodity, because people used it for flavoring things, and they also, even more importantly, used it um, for preserving meat and foodstuffs that you'd have to have salt to preserve things. And so it was very important. Now, coins were invented, I guess the very first ones that we've ever know about were they came about in around 600 BCE up in Lydia, and that's in modern day Turkey. And so it was basically what they did. They had mines there that had a mixture of silver and gold in the metal, and they could take these ores, kind of melt them together a little bit, and it would make an ore, or make a metal that was a mixture of silver and gold, and it was called electrum. And they would take the gold and this stuff, the metal, and they had made out or carved out these impressions in rocks and in stone, and then they would take the or they carve them somehow, get them into maybe into iron or in kind of metal of some sort. But they would take this softer metal, which was gold and silver mix, and they would put it down on the impression, and then they would take a some kind of a stamp, maybe just a hard cylindrical something or another, and they would hammer that gold down into the impression, and that's how they made an actual coin. And it was really not all that beautiful or a good looking thing. But one of the reasons that they would make these coin things is that it would have a standard value. It began to have a value that people recognized as a standard that, okay, if I've got one of these coins that was made out of gold or silver or whatever, then that's what most everybody says. That's the price. Two of those coins. That's the price of a nice calf or a cow or a sheep or if I had one of these gold things, I could buy two of those nice warm woolen blankets or whatever. I'm just making that up, but it came to be that the gold coins would have a standardized value, and so that became value in itself. And then governments they saw the value in that, so that they could standardize and categorize their wealth or whatever it is that they had, and they could say, yes, this we got this stuff and it's worth this many gold doubloons or whatever they would call them in the whatever the coin was. Now, even before this, several hundred years before this, the Israelites had a system sort of like that, but it was weights. It was just a weighted amount of a precious metal, so like silver. The shekels. They had shekels, and so they could trade in that, or they knew what the value of that shekel was. And in fact, God had told everybody that, okay, all the men over 20 had to pay a 1/2 shekel temple tax for the upkeep of the temple. So they already had something similar to the to these coins, but it was, nothing was standardized in that. Mostly it was a weight of some sort that they came up with how much of the shekel would weigh. And of course, then at that point they would say, well, okay, how do you know how much it's going to weigh? Well, they would have a system of weights, and somewhere along the line it became to be standardized. And so, but once they got coins of a certain size and metal, then it's, especially if they could make it all gold or all silver or whatever, then it would have a more of a standardized um, value. And so here is the oldest coin in the world. Okay, that I've seen several places, and they said, yeah, that's it. It's the oldest one, and it's a picture of a lion here. All right, and then on the back sides of these things, right here, this is what I'm talking about, where the stamp in reverse, that's where they had taken some piece of iron and jammed it into uh, basically the impression that was down in a stone or in another piece of metal or something like that. Then they would take and hammer that down into it until you got this this impression, and that was your coin. So even that was not really totally uniform, but it was a start. And I took some pictures of some other um, types of money. Like this is Chinese shell money. They would have these different cowrie shells, and they actually use that as a monetary system. And about if I'm not mistaken, 450 BCE, the Chinese then invented paper money. And before that, over in Spain and Cartagena and so forth, they had something similar. It was a certain kind of leather, a piece of leather that they would use for currency, because that leather was backed up somewhere by gold. And so that was kind of the first bit of a, some kind of like almost like a paper money. And over here in Yap, they had these great big circular stones that that they would use for money. And what they would do is that they didn't really carry these things around anywhere. They would bring them in. Actually, they brought them in on dugout canoes from an island, kind of, well, in a dugout canoe. It was a long way from Yap, but they would bring it across into Yap, and they would carve them up there. And what they would do is then these stones would then be stuck in a village somewhere in Yap, and they never moved them after that. I've got pictures of when I was out there back in the 80s. I was stationed out in that part of the world, and they would visit there on the ship, and they would have these stones in the various villages, and they just line them up. And I said, well, I asked somebody, said, well, how do you know? They said, oh, well, we just know because when somebody buys another piece of land or something like that, they'll say, yeah, I'm going to have like this big rock over here that's over in the village of Umtuquat, and then another one, and then I also have one of these stones that's over here in the village of what you call it, and those two stones then are the equivalent of the land I wanted to buy. And so somehow the people would know about it, and that's how they figured out who had what. Now, of course, they use a U.S. dollar now for their coinage, their monetary system, but that was pretty interesting back in those days, that they would have those, and the hole in the middle is where they would stick a pole through there, and a couple of guys could walk off with it. Now, these ones right here, some of those things are almost 5 feet tall. So they would take a whole bunch of guys and picking that thing up, and they would just move it a little at a time. And in some cases, they would actually just roll them. So there again, that's a different kind of a monetary system. All right. So any comments or questions about that? I just thought that would be interesting to throw in there as a moment of time this week. Any comments or questions about money? Okay. So let's go ahead then, and if you get the notes, I've got an article in there on the notes, and it's got more pictures, so it's more interesting. I just didn't want to spend a whole lot of time with it. All right. 2 Kings 4, 1 and 2. Now tonight we're going to be actually spending a good bit of time looking at basically 3 miracles with the prophet Elisha, Elisha, and Elisha, and I guess if you were going to say it right, but we're in Texas and everybody knows it as Elisha, and so I was going to keep, I always have these great aspirations of doing 3 or 4 chapters at a time, and then I end up with 1 chapter. So here we are. Now, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know that your servant feared Adonai. Now the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. What should I do? And Elisha asked her, what should I do for you? Tell me what do you have in the house? And she replied, your handmaid has nothing in the house except for a jar of oil. Now, this woman in Jewish practice and Jewish thought, and handed down through the ages, this woman was said to be the widow of the prophet Obadiah. and he was the prophet during the time of Ahab, and he hid 50 prophets and fed them and hid them in a cave, and he fed them, and the debt that he incurred to feed these 50 prophets was the debt that now someone is trying to take take her sons to pay for that debt. Now, in Jewish writings, the person that loaned the money to Obadiah to feed the prophets to keep them away from Ahab, interestingly enough, was the son of Ahab, Jehoram, and he was doing the he was kind of playing both ends against the middle, because he was charging Obadiah interest on the money that he was loaning to him so that he could buy food, and yet at the same time he his father wanted to round up all of these guys. So it's kind of interesting that that's not biblical, but it is it's the Jewish tradition there. Okay, so now this idea, a lot of people look at this and they say, well, how would you take somebody and take their children for the debt as a as surety for their debt? Well, that was just the way things were back in those days, and in fact it carried on even up until, my goodness, into the 19th and some places 20th century, where say for instance, if a person didn't pay his debts in jolly old England, well, then he could be thrown into debtor's prison. Well, if he's in prison, how in the world then is he going to work himself out of debt? And so as a result, his wife and children would suffer because they were in debt and they threw him into prison. And so until the debt was paid. Well, then how did that ever happen? So that was not a real good way to do things, but it did exist all the way up until like I said, into the 19th and early 20th century. And so but that was something that it was actually ubiquitous around the entire world, that if you got into debt and you died without paying off that debt, then the creditor could come and take your wife or your children depending, and that they would become your servants, your slaves, and so forth. Now, in Israel, there were certain rules about that if you had another Hebrew or Israelite slave that you owned for whatever reason, however you came into that, you could only own them for 6-7 years, and then on that 7th year, the Shemitah, then they could go free, and then certainly on the Jubilee, which would be the 50th year, then all lands and everything reverted back to the original family clans. So there was a way, in theory, that in Israel that you wouldn't have people being enslaved for generations, but actually the Jews, the Israelites, did not follow those rules that God had set out, and so people actually did stay in slavery a long time because they just didn't follow those rules. In fact, they didn't even do a Shemitah, and that's one of the reasons then that when they went into when Babylon conquered Israel or Judah and sent them into exile, they stayed in exile for 70 years. Because why? Because God said, you would not let the land rest. You wouldn't follow the Shemitah. And so my land will have its rest. So for 490 years, Israel had not let the land rest. And God said 490 divided by 7 and 7. Okay, that turns out to be 70 years of being enslaved by Babylon. And that and during that time, the land was pretty much empty, and the land did rest at that time. And so that was one of the rules of the Shemitah, and also letting debtors go at that 6th year was also part of it. All right. So now, any comments or questions on that before we go on? All right.
I just
Now,
want to say that in Afghanistan, that was still something that was going on, according to some of our soldiers that were there. They were still, they would have a field and grow opium or something on it. And if the opium crop failed, or we sprayed it or something like that, they'd be selling their daughters to the Taliban. So that system is still going.
yeah, it's kind of a barbaric system, actually. Now, the other thing that I wanted to bring out in these first couple of verses here is that where it says, now, Elisha says, well, what should I do for you? Elisha didn't have any money. And so, she's asking him, okay, help me out here. And he says, well, what can I do? What can I do? And so then he says, well, tell me, what do you have in the house? And so she said, all I've got is this jar of oil. Now, okay, all of my life, I have thought about it. She says, okay, we got this little jar of Crisco still left here, and we're going to take this and we're going to put it together, and that'll be it. And then we're just going to die, because we're out of cooking oil. We don't have anything to eat. And so I thought that that's what, they're talking about. But the Hebrew description of this little jar of oil or little jug of oil is not like the cruise of oil that you would keep olive oil in, for instance, or cooking oil or something. This was most likely a box of or a little jar of anointing oil, kind of like the woman that anointed Yeshua's feet with the expensive spices that was actually saved up for her burial. Well, this woman, she had probably sold everything that she already had to try to stay out of debt, and that's all she had left was the one little jar that she would have used for her own burial. And so she said, that's all I've got. And so that puts it in a whole new idea, for me anyway, it did, that we're not talking about cooking oil here. She's not God didn't tell her to go ahead and put cooking oil in all of these jars, and then you'll be able to pay off this debt and so forth. No, it was not just plain cooking oil, which was not all that expensive. This was basically your life-saving oil. This is the oil that you saved up and you earned and that you kept for your own burial, so that that you would have a decent burial, is what it is. That's your burial insurance. And so it was very expensive. And so then the idea then that this well, let's tell you what, let's go ahead and read the next portion here. It said, then go borrow for yourself vessels from all your neighbors, empty jars, not just a few. And Then go inside and shut the door behind you and behind your sons, and pour into all those vessels, setting aside what is full. So she left him and shut the doors behind her and behind her sons. They kept bringing the vessels to her, and she kept pouring. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There isn't another vessel." So the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God. So he said, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debt. Then you and your sons can live on the rest." So um, that's what the deal was. That this miracle was one that it was not just plain cooking oil. That would not have been enough oil for her to pay off her debt. But if this stuff, a little tiny jar that you could hold in your hand, was her insurance policy for all of her life, and then all of a sudden, she's been pouring it into jars, and perhaps she's got hundreds, maybe thousands more volume than she had to begin with, then this is this is quite a blessing. And so Elisha told her, he says, "Now bring your vessels and get these vessels, and bring not a few." There's an old Southern gospel type song, hymn thing, uh, that I can't. All I can remember is somewhere in the back of my mind, that it was saying something about bring your vessels, not a few, and and so forth. Somebody that's older than me can probably figure that one out. I don't know. Never mind, there's nobody here that's older than me. So, but there was actually a song that somebody back in the 20s, or even before, made up about this miracle. And so um, she went in there and borrowed all of these vessels, and then she went into the house, closed the doors, and shut herself and her sons up in there, because what did that do? That shut out all the distractions. And then that way no nosy neighbors or the impatient creditor could come around and see what are these guys doing. And so the whole time they're pouring this high dollar oil into all of these containers, and so that instead of just a little bit that she would have enough to buy her sons out of debt, so that they would not, she could totally pay off the creditor. And then she would have enough money to live on as a widow. And that's a big deal, that she would have enough money to live on until such time as her sons got to be old enough to work and support her, because that was Social Security back in those days. And okay, so Cynthia has found the song. So if anybody pulls that one up, I'm not going to pull it up right now, because what it would do is probably make all of my recordings wacky doodle. But you can pull that up. No, we will not. That will not make our worship list at Tree of Life. But anyway, that I can't wait to get off of here and find that one. All right. So let's see, where was I? So that volume, that oil paid off all of her debt and gave her a living wage then, until such time as her sons could take care of her. That's what Social Security looked like back in those days. All right. So it had nothing to do with cooking oil. There's nothing in this story that talks about enough oil um, to cook on. And that's not, it's in my mind, it's kind of a run on with the story of Elijah and the Shunnamite woman or not Shunammite, but where the widow that was getting enough oil or enough sticks. She was gathering sticks, and she had enough oil and a little bit of meal, and they were going to make a cake, and then they were going to eat that, and then they were going to die. And so that's that's where those stories kind of get blended together in your mind as a child, and then it's stuck in there until you're old. But anyway, it's unstuck now because now I know it wasn't cooking oil. All right, comments, questions? All right, well, let's go on to the next miracle here, next story anyway. One day when Elisha was he passed through Shunem. There was where there was a prominent woman who persuaded him to eat some food. And so it was, whenever he passed through, he would stop for a meal. Then she said to her husband, "Behold, now I realize that this man who often passes through is a holy man of God. Please, let's make a little walled room on the roof, and let's put there a bed, a table, and a chair, and a lampstand for him. Then, whenever he comes to us, he can stay there." So, in contrast, here's a picture of where Shunem is. You can see in relation to the Sea of Galilee, and then this was kind of on in this nice little valley here, and this is actually the city. It's called Shunem now, but that's was the village of Shunem. You can see there. Okay, and you can see that it's great for growing cantaloupes, or honeydew melons or something. And back, I was reading an article, a deal by some guy that had gone through there in the 1800s, and he said that it was great for growing grain, and it's just a good agricultural area. All right, so that's where Shunem was. Now, this woman it says she was a great, some of the translations will say she was a great woman, prominent woman, a rich woman, and all of those things, all of those descriptors would be accurate. And then there's in Jewish writings, one of the rabbis said that, yeah, actually, this was the sister of Abishag, who, if you remember right, when King David was 70 years old and he was just about to croak, that they got this young, beautiful woman from Shunem, a Shunammite woman by the name of Abishag, who was to go to bed with him and keep him warm. Well, the Bible says that they were never intimate, that she would just go there and try to keep him warm. That was what they thought would rejuvenate a guy if he had put a nice, beautiful, nubile young lady in bed with him. Then that would get everything flowing again, and never happened. David was beyond all that, but then she became prominent in other stories after that. We've already covered that. And so they say that she was the sister of Abishag. And we know then that this lady, the Shunammite woman, they don't give her name, but that she was a believer in God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She was a follower. She was not one of these that had given up God for the Baal and Ashtaroth and all of that. She was still following the one true God. All right, now Elisha's going through town and in his travels, and they said, well, on his way to Carmel, Mount Carmel, and so he said they went into Shunem. Well, Shunem is kind of an out of the way direction, but at the same time, they had schools of the prophets and so forth. So it was maybe like Elisha was doing his circuit to where he would go around and visit the various schools of the prophets or people that he ministered to. And so he was going through, and this lady asked him to come and eat with them. And remember now, Elisha would have had this mantle of the office of the prophet, and so people could look at him and say, okay, this is not the Fuller Brush man. This is a different kind of a guy. And so she asked him to come eat, and so evidently he and her family, they hit it off well enough that every time he would come to town, he was expected to come eat with them. And so eventually, then she says to her husband, hey, look, this guy is a man of God. Let's make a little apartment for him up on the roof, and made it in the wall of their house. So their house was a very, I mean, it was big. It was made of stone, and so they were quite wealthy that they could make an apartment for Elisha up on the roof, on the wall of their house. And it was fully furnished. It had a bed, a table, a chair, and a lampstand. I mean, what more could a prophet want? And did not have hot and cold running water. Okay, I can pretty much promise you that. So, but they were very generous, and they had this room for Elisha, and that's supposed to be Gehazi. And I don't know what happened there. I'll have to fix that. But anyway, that's what they did. They made up this room for him. And so then the story goes on. One day when he came there and retired to the upper chamber, and he was resting. And then he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite woman. And he called her, and she stood before him. He said to Gehazi, tell her, behold, you have gone to all this trouble for us. What can be done for you? Can something be communicated to the king or to the commander of the army for you? And she answered, I am living among my own people. So he asked so he asked, then what should be done for her? Then Gehazi answered, in fact, she has no son, and her husband is old. And call her, he said. At this season next year, you will be embracing a son. But she said, no, my lord, do not lie to your handmaid, man of God. Nevertheless, the woman conceived and bore a son during that season the following year, just as Elisha had told her. All right, so it's kind of interesting here, if you followed this, that Elisha did not speak directly to the woman, but through Gehazi. And so they were really making sure that there was nothing untoward, that this woman would not go into Elisha's quarters without, she didn't go into the quarters. She stood at the doorway, and then he spoke to her through Gehazi. And so then when he asked her, what can I do for you? And she said, nothing. And I liked her answer. She says, I live here among my own people. In other words, hey, I'm content. I'm here. I've got my own people, my support network, my friends, my family. I've got everything that I could want or need. And so then evidently then she walked away. And so then Elisha's talking to Gehazi and says, well, what does she want? And Gehazi said, well, she doesn't have a son. So evidently Gehazi had picked that up from the servants or whatever, or just his observation that, these people don't have an heir. They don't have a son. So everybody wants a son and heir. And so Elisha said, okay, well, call her back up here. And so she came back up there, and then that's when he told her that, she was going to have a baby. And so, even though she was wealthy, she was barren, or perhaps they said her husband was old, so maybe he was just too old to get the job done. We don't know. Either way, she didn't have any children. I mean, that was the bottom line. She didn't have any children, and so that's what God could do for her. And so, you know, when he told her that, she reacted sort of like other women in the Bible who did not have children, that God you know, told them they were going to have children. And you know, it wasn't like, you know, Sarah, who stood behind the tent door giggling and then denying it, or you know, the other women who were just very, very surprised, overwhelmed that God would do that for them. So so that was, you know, and it happened just exactly the way that it said, that, you know, within a year, when Elisha came back through, yep, sure enough, she had a son. And so let's go ahead with the next. I'm missing a slide in there someplace, I don't know. All right. In 2 Kings 4:18-21. Now, when the child was grown, one day he went out to his father among the reapers. Then he said to his father, my head, my head. So he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. So he picked him up, brought him to his mother. The child sat on her lap until noon, then died. So then she then went up, laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut the door on him, and went out. All right. So the boy, you know, it says, now when the child was grown, that that really doesn't mean that he was an adult, because you know, otherwise the servant couldn't have picked him up and carried him back to the house, and then the mother would not have been able to pick him up and take him upstairs, because, you know, they didn't have stairs to go up there. It was a ladder that was on an incline, so you had to kind of walk up this ladder. It was not a stairway. In well, maybe they did because they were wealthy, but generally speaking, those upper quarters, you had a kind of a ladder thing. And anyway, she was able to pick him up and lay him in the bed of Elisha. And so she closed the door and didn't say anything. She just wouldn't admit. She didn't want to admit that he was dead until she talked to the prophet. And we don't know what happened to the kid. I mean, if he was out there and it was harvesting, he could have gotten a heat stroke or something like that. We don't know. It's not important to the story, but we do know that he came back, sat in his mother's arms until noon, and died. And so she laid him on Elisha's bed, and then she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back. But he said, why are you going to him today? It's neither new moon, Rosh Chodesh, nor is it Shabbat. But she said, it will be well. And so, all right, now, so here's a guy that, man, he had complete trust in his wife, okay? Because he didn't have a clue what was going on. You know, just, he was clueless. And she came to him and says, can I have a servant and a donkey so that I can go and see the prophet, the man of God? Well, I mean, this was not walking around the corner. This was a 4-hour journey to go to where Elisha was, and because it was about 15 miles. A donkey, when he's walking, is going to go about 4 miles per hour. Now, maybe a little bit faster if he was on a trot, you know. And in fact, I learned doing this study here that a donkey can actually run about 40 miles an hour for short distances. Now, I have actually ridden a donkey a couple of times, and my cousin had one, and I rode that donkey a good bit. And a donkey running is very, very uncomfortable. Okay, you can get on them and they can kind of trot, and that's kind of okay. Maybe it beats walking. I don't know, but a donkey running, they don't have that lope that a horse does that you can get into and ride him. A donkey running is, I don't know. It's just you're all over the place, bouncing everywhere, because he's already bouncing everywhere. Just take it from me. All right. Mules are different. Mules actually do lope like that. You can gallop a mule, and that's not so bad. That's more of a comfortable ride. All right. That was not in my notes, by the way. All right. So anyway, her husband said, "Yeah, go do what you got to do," and so she took off. And so then she saddled the donkey, said to her servant, "Move on. Don't slow down riding unless I tell you." And so this servant was actually not riding a donkey with her or anything. He was going to be on the rear end of that donkey with the sticks, whacking him in the rear end to make sure he kept on going. So she set out and came near the man of God at Mount Carmel. Upon seeing her from a distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's the Shunammite woman. Please run out to meet her and ask her, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the boy?' She answered, 'It is well.' And but when she arrived at the mountain up to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. Then Gehazi stepped forward to push her away, but the man of God said, 'Leave her alone, for her soul is bitter within her, yet Adonai has hid it from me and has not told me.' Then he said to Gehazi, he's not told me. And then she pipes up and says, 'Did I ask my Lord for a son?' She said. 'Didn't I say, don't deceive me?' And then he said to Gehazi, 'Gird up your loins, take my staff in your hand, and go. If you meet someone, don't greet him. If anyone greets you, don't answer him. And you lay my staff on the face of the child.' But the mother of the child said, 'As Adonai lives, and as you live, I won't leave you.' So he arose and followed her." I thought it's kind of interesting that now here is a woman. You know that old deal about you never get between a woman and her child. The mama grizzly comes out. Well, this one is boy, she's adamant. I need to have Elisha come to minister to this boy, not Gehazi. And so Elisha said, "Okay," and he followed her. In other words, man, she's out the door heading back home. And so Elisha is just following along, behind her, because she's already heading down the door. And remember now, all of this started when about noon, when the child died, and then she had to get the donkey, had to get the servant. So here she is. It has taken her just about till sunset to get to Mount Carmel. Then they turn right around and head back to Shunem. So this was a long trip for her to go up there. 8 to 10 hours on that donkey, and so quite a feat for her. So it's kind of interesting that God, that Elisha saw her coming, but God didn't reveal what the situation was. And all she would say when asked is, "It is well. It is well." And so once she got there, she grabbed onto Elisha's feet. Well, that's Gehazi must have thought that, okay, this is undignified. You don't do that to the man of God, to God's prophet. And so he was going to push her away, but Elisha said, "Whoa, wait, she's got a problem here. She is in great anguish." And so at that time, then God still didn't reveal that the boy had died. So Mama unloaded on Elisha. And so then at that point, he must have figured out what had happened. And he told Gehazi, go take the staff, touch the boy, and he would revive. And, the mother would not have any part of it. No, she was not going to settle for anything but Elisha. So here they went. All right. And Gehazi passed on ahead of them, laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or response. So he returned to meet him and told him, the boy has not awakened. When Elisha entered the house, there was the child dead and laying on his bed. So he entered the door, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to Adonai. Then he got up, lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself upon him. So the flesh of the child became warm. Then he stepped down, walked in the house to and fro, and then he got, let me roll this on. Then he stepped down, walked in the house to and fro. Then he got up on the bed and stretched himself on him. The child sneezed 7 times. Then the child opened his eyes. Then he called Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite woman. So he called her, and when she came into him, he said, pick up your son. She came, fell at his feet, and bowed down on the ground. She picked up her son and went out. So, wow, what a deal that would have been. Gehazi, of course, he went ahead. He ran on ahead, just like Elisha had told him before, go do this, and he went ahead. And evidently the woman did not object to this because she knew that Elisha was on his way there, so that was okay. And but when Gehazi got there, laid the staff on the kid's face, nothing happened, no response, nothing. So when he arrived, he closed the door. And, he didn't want any distractions. Now, his actions, okay, the things that he did, a little bit strange by anybody's standards today, especially today. What would have happened there? This idea of putting his hands on. But remember, back in those days, the idea of body warmth. Okay, they thought that, that if you could get the body warm again, then life would come back. Putting his mouth on his mouth. Maybe he thought that, perhaps he could inflate the lungs. So it appears that Elisha did all of the things that that would be naturally possible. He took the natural steps. And so that would be something that we would, today, when we see a situation, we can take natural steps. We can go to the doctor. We can, if somebody has, they stopped breathing or something, by all means, do CPR. When our grandson died, we did, Pat and my son did CPR, but at the same time, we're praying for that kid. And, but they're doing CPR. They're doing the natural things, doing everything that they knew how to do. And so then God brought our son back. He brought this son back, our grandson. He brought this son back too. And so there again, Elisha doing everything he knew how to do, but then God stepped in, and that didn't work. So he paced around a little bit. He's praying, and then he goes back over and lays himself across the boy, and he sneezed 7 times. And there's a whole bunch of teaching and thoughts about, okay, sneezing 7 times. What does that mean? Well, we're not going to do that tonight. Okay, so any comments or questions? I'm running really late on this thing. I knew better than to try to do a whole bunch of more chapters than just one. All right, any comments or questions? All right, let's just finish off this last little story here. um, Elisha returned to Gilgal. There was a famine in the land, and the sons of the prophets were sitting before him. He said to his servant, get on a large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. Then one of them went out into the field to gather herbs, found a wild vine, picked from it a lapful of wild gourds. Then he came back, sliced up the stew pot, for they didn't know what they were. Then they served it for the men to eat. But it came to pass as they were still eating the stew, they cried out and said, "Oh, man of God, there is death in the pot." So they could not eat it. But he said, "Bring some flour." And he threw flour into the pot and said, "Serve it to the people and let them eat." So there was nothing bad in the pot. And now a man had come from Baal Shalishah and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of corn in his sack. Okay, corn, they didn't have corn, but it was some kind of grain. And then he said, "Give them to the people that they may eat." But his attendant said, "What? Will I set this before 100 men?" But he said, "Give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says Adonai, they will eat, will have leftover." So he set it before them, and they ate, and he had some left over, according to the word of Adonai. All right, so here is there's a famine. You know, there's remember, this is Israel. They were apostate. They were against doing all sorts of things against God. And they got these school of prophets that are they're hanging in there. They're the remnant, but there's still a famine in the land, because that's just what happens when you turn away from God. And so they sent Gehazi and these guys out to gather something to eat, because they were hungry. Okay, so what do? There's nothing around here. Let's go find something to eat. So they found this wild vine that had gourds on it, and came back and chopped them up, threw them in the pot, and after a while they said, "Oh no, this is killing us. We can't eat this stuff. This is poison." And so he said, "Okay, here, throw this flour in there." Threw the flour in there, and they could eat it. I'll tell you what about the first guy to eat the stuff after they already knew it was poison? And Elisha had thrown some flour in there and said, "Okay, it's good to go now." Okay, that first guy that would go in there and say, "Okay, I guess I'll try it." And so then they all ate, and then somebody else came and said, "Look, I got 20 loaves of barley bread." Okay, now I don't know how big these loaves were, but he said, his Gehazi said, "Wait, what? You're gonna feed 100 people with this bread? You can't do it." And Elisha said, "Just give it to them. They will, and there will be leftovers." He said, "Not because I said it, because Adonai said it, that they will eat and will have leftovers." And so they set it before them. They ate and had some leftover, according to the word of Adonai. So here's, that brings us kind of the idea. Remember that when Yeshua was in his ministry, and he went out and fed the 5,000. Another time fed the 4,000. There was food left over. And so anyway, that is this story finishes off our lesson for tonight. Now,